In our last episode, we worked our way through Tier 5 on the complete video game console Iceberg, getting into some pretty rare and obscure consoles, but now it's time to go even further. We're officially halfway to the bottom, so let's drop down to Tier 6, where we'll start getting into some consoles you've probably never even heard of, even if you are a diehard gamer or a collector. But even if you have, I hope you'll still learn something from the video. It's starting to get very difficult to find old commercials and print media, but I'm determined to bring you at least a brief history of every single video game console ever made. So let's get right into it, take a deep dive into Tier 6, starting with a little known video game console made by one of the largest computer and electronic manufacturers in the world, Apple.
Pippin.
The Apple Pippin was designed by Apple Computers in 1996, not only as a video game console, but a multimedia device. Apple licensed the console to the Bandai Corporation for release in Japan. It sold for $599, which is equivalent to around $1,200 today, accounting for inflation. The Pippin is a 5th generation game console based on the Apple Macintosh computer platform and runs the classic Mac OS operating system. It has a 66 MHz PowerPC processor and 8 MB of RAM, with upgradable RAM modules available. A PCI expansion slot was also built into the system, and Apple encouraged third-party companies to develop peripherals to use this PCI expansion port. The Pippin came with one gamepad controller and also had a built-in dial-up modem for internet access. Some accessories made for the system included a docking station with a 3.5-inch floppy drive, a 320 MB external disk drive, a wireless gamepad controller called the Apple Jack, and a keyboard/drawing pad with a stylus that resembles a tablet. Games were manufactured on CD-ROM format, and in total there were well over 100 games developed for the Pippin, although most of them were only available in Japan. There were about 15 games released to the US market, but the consoles and games are not region locked, so you can play any of the games on any variation of the console if you can get your hands on them. 3 main variations of the Pippin were produced: the original Bandai Pippin Atmark, which was released in the US and Japan in 1996 and was available in black or white. The Bandai Pippin World, which was released the same year, was only available in black and was basically just a standard Pippin, but it came with a free 6-month internet account bundled with the console. And the Cat's Media Pippin KMP 2000 that released in 1997 in Canada and Europe and was only available in gray. This is the rarest of the 3 versions of the console. All 3 systems were essentially the same, but for the Cat's version having an SCSI interface port available on the back of the console. By the time the Pippin was released, the home video game market was already dominated by the Sega Saturn, Sony PlayStation, and Super Nintendo, and with such a small and lackluster game library, along with a $599 price tag, the Pippin was far too expensive to compete. When Steve Jobs returned to Apple in 1997, he stopped development of the Pippin and forced Bandai and Cat's Media to stop production of their versions of the console as well. So during its very short 2-year lifespan, it is estimated that only about 42,000 consoles were sold worldwide, making the Pippin very hard to come by for collectors even today. And that's the brief history of Apple's very short-lived home video game console that you may have not known about. Now from here, we're going back a few years to 1980 to the Commodore Corporation and their 8-bit video game system, the Commodore 64 GS. The Commodore 64 game system, more commonly referred to as the Commodore 64 GS, is a cartridge-based game console based on their popular Commodore 64 home computer of the time. It was released exclusively in Europe in 1990 at a price of £99, which is about $250 today, converted and adjusted for inflation. The C64 GS was not Commodore's first gaming system based on the C64 hardware. However, unlike the 1982 Max machine, a game-oriented computer based on a very cut-down version of the same hardware family, the C64 gaming system is internally very similar to the Commodore 64 computer and is technically compatible with most of its software. The 64 GS came bundled with a cartridge that had 4 games on it. These included Fiendish Freddy's Big Top of Fun, International Soccer, Limbo's Quest, and Clax. Commodore promised a game library of over 100 games, but in the end only 28 were made, and only 9 of them were new games made for the console. Most of them were just ports of much older games from the 1980s. But the problems with the 64 GS don't stop there. Despite having lots of games and software already available on cartridges from the Commodore 64 computer, the lack of a keyboard for the 64 GS meant that most of them couldn't be used with the console. This meant that most of the Commodore 64 games and software, while technically compatible with the 64 GS, were completely unplayable on the console. One example is the standard Commodore 64 version of Terminator 2 Judgment Day that was actually designed for the console. The game required the user to press a key on a keyboard at the start menu to access the game. But since the 64GS didn't have a keyboard or a port to even plug one in, the game was literally unplayable. You could, however, play the game on a standard Commodore 64 computer using a joystick like the one the 64GS had. So overall, the 64GS was a complete failure. It was poorly designed, had old, dated games, and had no accessories. All of that and the fact that it was trying to compete with Nintendo, Sega, and PlayStation meant the end for the 64GS. In total, there were 80,000 consoles produced, but Commodore could only sell 20,000 of them. The 64GS was a big L for Commodore. Moving on from one failed console to another, we head back to Japan to the NEC Corporation and their last video game console they ever produced, the PC-FX. The PC-FX is a 32-bit game console developed by NEC and released in 1994. It was the successor to the TurboGrafx 16 and Turbo Duo, and was only released in Japan at a price of 50,000 yen, which is just over $1,000 today, converted and adjusted for inflation. Its form factor is designed to be more like a tower PC than a game console, so it could be easily upgraded with more memory and peripherals. However, due to the fact that the PC-FX did not have a 3D polygon-based graphics chip, it was inferior to the other 5th generation consoles of the time. The PC-FX used CD-ROM for its games, doing away with the HuCard games from the TurboGrafx. The controller is almost identical to the 6-button controller from the Turbo Duo, except the turbo buttons were replaced with standard A and B buttons. The game library consisted of 62 games, most of which were based on popular Japanese anime franchises. Launch games included titles like Graduation 2 Neo Generation FX, Battle Heat, and Team Innocent. A large portion of the PC-FX games were essentially just anime videos with cutscenes allowing the user to play games for a bit in between the videos. The reason for this was that while the PC-FX lacked 3D graphics, it could process 30 pictures per second, allowing it to play full motion video faster and with better quality than any other console at the time. So NEC took advantage of this and made most of its games primarily just videos. However, the fact that games weren't very immersive, the console lacked 3D graphics, and it was incredibly expensive, the PC-FX was a commercial failure. It was discontinued in 1998 after less than 4 years of production and would be the last video game console NEC would ever produce. In total, only about 400,000 consoles were sold. Moving on from NEC to one of the more weird-looking consoles on the iceberg, we head back to the US for the ViewMaster Interactive Vision. The ViewMaster Interactive Vision was released in 1989 only in the US at a price of $120, which is equivalent to about $280 today, adjusted for inflation. The console was marketed to younger kids, and most of the games were based on Disney or Sesame Street franchises. The Interactive Vision is different than most other video game consoles, and that games were stored on VHS tapes rather than cartridges, discs, or cassettes. The system came with a simple controller that included a joystick and 5 buttons, and a VCR was required to play the games on a television. The console would then add graphics on screen over the video. As the video played, characters on screen would talk to the player and ask them questions or tell them to make choices determining the gameplay outcome. For example, at the end of the game Muppet Madness, Kermit the Frog and Gonzo ask you to choose which character you want to sing the closing song. In Kermit's version, he sings a song called Everything Was Wonderful, and in Gonzo's version, he sings a different song called Everything Was Terrible. Due to the fact that games were on a VHS tape, there is only one video track. The console digitally generates graphics to overlay on top of the video, such as the movement of characters' mouths. This allowed it to appear that the characters are talking directly to the player with custom animations. In the game Muppet Studio Presents, you're the director, Kermit asks you to create a Muppet movie in the game and allows the player to choose to be a good director or a bad director. During the game, you have to collect money bags that are displayed on the screen, and if you don't collect enough of them, the game ends. In total, there were only 7 games produced for the Interactive Vision, and they were all pretty basic 8-bit graphics similar to the ColecoVision. As you can probably guess, the console didn't do very well, and was soon discontinued the next year. I couldn't find the exact number of consoles sold, but it's estimated to be less than 50,000. And while they are pretty rare, they aren't really sought out by collectors today. Moving on from the Interactive Vision to a more traditional game console that is actually very rare today, the Funtech Super Acan. The Super Acan is a 16-bit video game console released exclusively in Taiwan in 1995 at a cost of 2,900 new Taiwan dollars, which is equivalent to about 185 US dollars today, converted and adjusted for inflation. It's based around the Motorola 68000 microchip, which is also used in the Sega Genesis and the Neo Geo. The controller was similar in appearance to the Super Nintendo controller, with a directional pad, start, select, and 4 face buttons. It used the same controller connector port as the Sega Genesis, but it wasn't compatible with Genesis controllers due to the internal wiring. Only 12 games were made for the system, mostly fighting and platform games such as Sango Fighters and Super Dragon Force. There were 11 other games planned to be released, but the console was discontinued before they could be completed. A CD-ROM attachment, similar to Sega's Mega CD add-on, was also planned but was never released. The Super Acan failed because it was too expensive, and due to the fact that it was a 16-bit console released in the 32-bit era, it had no chance of competing with the PlayStation, N64, and Sega Saturn that had 3D graphics, while the Acan still had Sega Genesis hardware. The console sold so poorly that Funtech actually lost $6 million producing it. Just 1 year after being released, the console was discontinued in 1996, and Funtech destroyed all of the equipment used to make the consoles and sold the leftover systems as scrap parts. Because of this, the console is incredibly rare and hard to find today. And that's the brief history of the Super Acan. Now let's talk about another multimedia gaming device, the Tandy VIS. The Tandy Video Information System, or VIS for short, is an interactive multimedia player similar to the 3DO, CDI, and CDTV we've already talked about. It was released in 1992 at a price of $699, which is about $1,500 today adjusted for inflation. The Tandy VIS was sold exclusively at Radio Shack stores using the Memorex brand, both of which Tandy owned at the time. The VIS had an Intel 286 CPU, 1MB of ROM, 1MB of RAM, and a built-in modem for internet access. It ran on a modular version of the Windows 3.1 operating system and used CD-ROM as its media format. It was capable of connecting up to 2 wireless controllers simultaneously. About 65 games and media were made for the VIS, most of which were learning software like encyclopedias, ebooks, and translators. Only 10 true games were produced for the VIS, and the games were far from exciting. The more popular game titles were Lynx, The Challenge of Golf, Sherlock Holmes, Consulting Detective, and The Adventures of Victor Vector and Yondo, The Vampire's Coffin. The VIS was not a successful console at all, partly due to the fact that it was a Radio Shack exclusive, and partly due to the large amount of competition from other multimedia consoles of the time. Radio Shack employees jokingly referred to the VIS acronym meaning virtually impossible to sell. After only 2 years of production, the system was discontinued early in 1994, having only sold 11,000 units, making it a very rare system today. Alright, let's jump back to the early 1980s, to the very beginning of the home video game console era, and take a look at the Epoch Cassette Vision. The Cassette Vision is a home video game console made by Epoch and released exclusively in Japan in 1981. It sold for 13,500 yen, which is equivalent to about 325 US dollars today, converted and adjusted for inflation. The Cassette Vision is a second-generation console and has similar hardware to the Atari 2600. It's the successor to the TV Vader console that was made the year before in 1980. The TV Vader was only available with one game, Space Invaders, and it was built into the game system. So although technically it is a video game console, I've decided that I won't be including it on a tier of its own. Now back to the Cassette Vision. In the US, we think of cassettes as a magnetic audio tape from the 80s, but in Japan, the cassette is a name given to a standard ROM cartridge used to store video games. The controls for the Cassette Vision are very strange. It consists of 4 knobs built into the console itself, and they aren't unremovable controllers, so the players have to sit at the console to play games. A light gun was available to use with 4 of its shooting games, which connected to the console using an aux connector. This was the only accessory ever made for the console. There were only 12 games produced, and they were priced at 4,000 yen, which is about $100 today. Game titles included Baseball, Astro Command, Pac Monster, and Battle Vader. The reason for the high cost of the games is the fact that the ROM, RAM, and the CPU are all in one chip stored in the game cartridge itself. The console itself would only contain the power supply, the controls, and the video and sound output. 2 years later, in 1983, Epoch released the Cassette Vision Jr. that was a minimal version of the standard Cassette Vision. It removed the knobs on the console and replaced them with more traditional switches and buttons. However, it also removed the aux connector, so the light gun can't be used with this system. With Nintendo releasing the Famicom system in Japan in 1983, which was a much more powerful and superior system, Epoch decided to discontinue the Cassette Vision in 1984 after 4 years of production, having sold about 400,000 units. Now let's move on to another console from the early 1980s, and one that is very similar to the Cassette Vision Jr., the Arcadia 2001. The Arcadia 2001 is a second-generation video game console released by the Emerson Radio Company in 1982 at a price of $99 or about $300 today adjusted for inflation. The console had a controller very similar to the Intellivision, with a 12-button keypad, fire buttons on the side, and a directional pad that a joystick could be attached to. The console itself had 5 buttons including power, reset, start, select, and option. The system had a 3.5 MHz Signetic 2650 CPU, 1 KB of RAM, 208 by 128 screen resolution, and a built-in speaker to produce beeps for audio. The power supply for the Arcadia ran at 12 volts, so it could technically be used in a car or a boat. 35 games were produced for the console in cartridge format, and another 12 games were made for the clone consoles. More popular game titles included Astro Invader, Crazy Climber, and Route 16. Emerson actually created more popular games like Pac-Man, Galaxian, and Defender for the Arcadia console, but was never able to release them because Atari started to sue. Some of these games, such as Breakaway and Space Raiders, were later released as clone games. Emerson licensed rights to the console to Bandai in Japan, and over 30 clones were made to sell worldwide. Some of these include the Hanimex HMG 2650 that was released in Germany, Canada, and Australia, the Intervision 2001 released in Switzerland and Finland, the Ormatu 2001 that was sold only in the Netherlands, the Soundic MPT-03 released in Singapore and Finland, and the Chico Telefever released only in Germany. Even though the console was produced for a variety of countries around the world, it failed to compete with the Atari 2600 and other consoles of the era, and after only a year and a half of production, the Arcadia 2001 was discontinued in 1984. And that's it for Tier 6 of the complete video game console Iceberg. If you made it this far, I really do appreciate it, and if you took a second to click the like button, that would be amazing. Let me know in the comments if you had any of these rare game consoles, or if you had the opportunity to play any of them. We're starting to get into some of the really rare and more obscure consoles now, and there will be even more in the next episode. I have a lot in store for the channel, and I upload a new video every single week, so be sure to subscribe if you want to get notified of new Iceberg videos. I also have a poll on my channel in the community tab, so you can help me choose the Iceberg series I do next. So be sure to check that out and vote which Iceberg topic you want to see in the series after I'm finished with this one. I'll do that with each and every Iceberg video series I make, so you, the viewer, will determine what videos get made next. You can follow me on all social media platforms at IcebergDocs if you want to stay updated and connect with me. And if you want to help support the channel, you can do that too by becoming a Patreon, where you'll get early access to all my documentaries before they get to YouTube. Links are in the description. Again, I thank each and every one of you for your support and for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.